At 91 years old, living in my son's mansion felt like waiting to die in cold silence. He barely spoke to me anymore, and I spent my days alone in my room. Then Tuesday morning he walked in carrying a glass of fresh green juice with a smile I hadn't seen in years, said he made it specially for me to help with my energy. My heart filled with unexpected joy, thinking maybe he still loved me. But behind the smile was something dangerous. But when I said your wife already drank this, his life shattered. He started panicking. Before I tell you what next, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so more people hear this story. At 91 years old, living in my son David's home felt like existing as a ghost nobody wanted to acknowledge, spending most days sitting alone in the guest room he'd given me, staring out the window with nothing to do. David barely spoke to me beyond brief practical questions about whether I needed medication or had eaten. Never sat down for actual conversation or asked about my day or my feelings. His wife Monica avoided me almost completely, would leave rooms when I entered them, made it clear through her body language that my presence in their mansion was an unwelcome burden she tolerated out of obligation. Felt invisible and unwanted most of the time, like I was just taking up space in their large house waiting to die so they could move on with their lives without the inconvenience of an elderly father. Would hear them talking and laughing in other rooms, but the conversation would stop when I'd shuffle in with my walker, replaced by polite silence until I'd leave again. Ate meals alone in my room, because sitting at their table felt awkward and uncomfortable, could sense they'd rather I wasn't there even though nobody said it directly. The loneliness was crushing in ways that physical pain never was. Had survived 91 years and raised my son alone after his mother died young, only to end up isolated in a house full of people who wished I wasn't there. Started wondering if I'd been wrong to refuse assisted living facilities when David had suggested them months ago. Maybe being around other elderly people who actually wanted company would be better than living with family who treated me like a burden. But David had insisted I stay with them, said it was the right thing to do, even though his actions showed he didn't really want me there. That Tuesday morning started like every other morning in recent months. Woke up alone in my room around 7 and slowly got myself dressed and ready for another long day of nothing. Heard David and Monica moving around the house getting ready for their day. Heard them talking in the kitchen but didn't go down because I knew my presence would just make them uncomfortable. Sat in my chair by the window waiting for nothing in particular, just passing time until the next meal or the next medication or the next meaningless day. Then around 9 o'clock, David knocked on my door and came in carrying a tall glass of thick green juice, the kind made from vegetables and fruits that health-conscious people drank. He was smiling at me in a warm, genuine way I hadn't seen in years. Not the polite, tight smile he usually gave me, but actual warmth in his eyes. My heart jumped with unexpected hope seeing that expression, thinking maybe something had changed and my son still cared about me after all these months of cold distance. David walked over and handed me the glass, saying he'd made this specially for me, thought it might help with my energy levels since I'd been seeming tired and weak lately. Said it had kale and spinach and ginger and other healthy ingredients that would be good for someone my age. The gesture felt so kind and thoughtful after months of being ignored, made me want to cry with gratitude that my son had taken time to think about my health and make something specifically for me. Held the cold glass in my trembling hands, feeling warmth spread through my chest, from the simple act of my son showing he cared. From him smiling at me like he used to when he was younger and we'd been close. Started to lift the glass to my lips, ready to drink whatever he'd made because he'd made it for me with love. Ready to taste his care and concern, even if the juice was bitter or unpleasant. The smile on his face made everything feel right for the first time in months, but something made me pause with the glass halfway to my mouth, a memory from earlier that morning flickering in my mind. Remembered walking past the kitchen around 8:30 and seeing Monica standing at the counter drinking from a glass that looked exactly like the one David had just handed me, same thick green color and same tall glass. Mentioned it to David casually without thinking, just making conversation and sharing that his wife must have liked this juice too since she'd been drinking it earlier. What I didn't know while holding that glass of green juice and feeling grateful for my son's sudden kindness was that David had been planning my death for months with calculated deliberation. He was drowning in business debts from failed investments and a commercial real estate venture that had collapsed during the economic downturn, owed over $2 million to various creditors and banks who were threatening legal action. His lifestyle of expensive cars and the large mansion and private schools for his children was completely unsustainable without an influx of capital he didn't have access to. My $12 million estate in Florida was the solution to all his financial problems. Property and investments I'd accumulated over decades of working in commercial development before retiring. David knew he was my sole heir and that everything would pass to him upon my death, had been obsessively checking the terms of my will and trust documents with his attorney. The estate included valuable waterfront property, stock portfolios, and cash assets that would immediately solve his debt crisis and secure his family's financial future for generations. But at 91 years old, I was inconveniently healthy despite my age, my doctor saying I could easily live another 5 or more years based on my vital signs and lack of serious medical conditions. David couldn't wait that long with creditors demanding payment and threatening to seize his assets, couldn't risk me living long enough to see him declare bankruptcy and lose everything. Had started viewing me as an obstacle to his financial survival rather than his father. An old man taking too long to die naturally when he desperately needed that inheritance immediately. David had spent weeks researching methods to kill an elderly person in ways that would look like natural causes, searching online for information about untraceable poisons and how to fake heart attacks in people my age. Discovered that rat poison in sufficient doses could cause symptoms similar to heart failure or stroke, internal bleeding that might be attributed to my age and natural decline. The poison was easy to purchase under fake names at hardware stores, cheap and readily available, brutally effective when administered in the right quantities. Had been planning the timing carefully, waiting for an opportunity when Monica would be out of the house for several hours, when he could give me the poison juice and then discover me dead later claiming natural causes. My advanced age would make authorities unlikely to order an autopsy. Most doctors would simply sign a death certificate attributing my passing to heart failure or age-related complications. Within weeks, he could begin the process of inheriting and liquidating my estate, paying off his debts before his creditors could take legal action. The thick green juice was the perfect delivery method because the bitter taste of rat poison could be masked by strong flavors like kale and ginger. The texture would hide any graininess from dissolved powder. David had prepared the poisoned glass that morning with enough rat poison to kill me within hours, mixed it carefully to look identical to the healthy juices Monica made regularly for herself. Planned to give it to me with a smile and caring words, wanted my last moments to include thinking my son still loved me. Had practiced his reaction to finding me dead, planned to call emergency services in apparent distress and grief, would tell responders he'd brought me juice earlier and I'd seemed fine, but now wasn't breathing. The story was simple and believable, an elderly father passing away peacefully in his son's home after his loving son had tried to help him stay healthy. Nobody would suspect murder when a 91-year-old man died of apparent heart failure, especially when his son seemed appropriately devastated. David's desperation to inherit had overridden any remaining love or loyalty he felt toward me. Financial pressure transforming him from someone who tolerated my presence to someone actively plotting my murder. The smile he'd given me when handing over the poisoned juice was completely fake, manufactured specifically to ensure I'd drink willingly and gratefully. Every kind word had been calculated manipulation designed to make me trust him enough to consume poison he'd prepared with his own hands. He'd been waiting months for me to die naturally, and viewing each day I remained alive as another day closer to his financial ruin. Had finally decided he couldn't wait any longer and needed to take action. That Tuesday morning was supposed to be the day he murdered his father and inherited $12 million. The day he'd solve all his problems by ending my life. Held the cold glass of thick green juice in my shaking hands, feeling warmth in my chest from David's unexpected kindness, ready to drink whatever he'd made because he'd made it specifically for me with what seemed like genuine care. The juice looked healthy and fresh with that deep green color from vegetables, smelled strongly of ginger and something citrus that made my nose wrinkle slightly. Started lifting the glass toward my mouth, ready to take my first grateful sip. thinking this moment marked a turning point where my son remembered he still loved his father. But just before the glass touched my lips, a memory flickered in my mind from earlier that morning, something I'd seen while shuffling past the kitchen around 8:30. Remembered seeing Monica standing at the counter holding a tall glass of green juice that looked exactly like what I was holding now, same thick consistency and same dark green color. She'd been drinking from it while checking her phone, hadn't noticed me walking past with my walker because she'd been focused on her screen. The observation felt worth mentioning as casual conversation, thought maybe David had made a batch of this healthy juice for the whole family and everyone was drinking it. Lowered the glass slightly and said to David with a smile that his wife had been drinking this same juice about 10 minutes ago in the kitchen, that I'd seen her with an identical glass when I'd walked past. Added that it must be really good if both of them were having it, tried to make it sound like I was grateful to be included in their healthy habits. My words were completely innocent and grateful, just an old man happy to be thought of and included in family routines instead of isolated and forgotten. Wasn't trying to catch David in anything or question what he'd given me, genuinely believed Monica had been drinking the same healthy juice from the same batch. The comment was meant as appreciation that he'd shared something his wife enjoyed with his elderly father, connecting me to their lives in a small way. David's reaction to my casual observation was so extreme and unexpected that it took several seconds for my brain to process what was happening. His face drained of all color instantly, like blood had been sucked out of his body, his eyes going wide with an expression of pure horror and panic I'd never seen before. The warm smile vanished, completely replaced by absolute terror, his mouth opening in shock as he processed what I'd just told him about Monica drinking the juice. The glass flew from my hands as David grabbed it violently, snatched it away with such force that green juice splashed across my shirt and the carpet. He didn't say anything or explain, just screamed a wordless sound of panic and terror, turned and sprinted from my room, moving faster than I'd ever seen him move. His footsteps thundered down the hallway toward the kitchen, heard him screaming Monica's name with desperate fear in his voice that echoed through the entire house. Sat frozen in my chair, completely confused about what had just happened. Couldn't understand why my innocent comment about Monica drinking juice had caused such an extreme reaction. The joy and warmth I'd felt moments ago when David had smiled at me curdled into sick dread in my stomach. Some instinct telling me something was terribly wrong even though I didn't understand what. David's terror had been real and visceral. Not annoyance or frustration, but genuine panic, like he'd just learned someone was in mortal danger. Started hearing crashes and more screaming from the kitchen, heard David's voice raised in what sounded like sobbing and desperation mixed together. Monica's voice joined in, sounding confused and frightened, asking what was wrong and why he was acting crazy. The sounds coming from downstairs were wrong in ways that made my hands shake and my heart pound, made me grip the arms of my chair, trying to decide if I should go see what was happening. Slowly stood up and grabbed my walker, started making my way toward my bedroom door, with my heart racing from fear and confusion. Something catastrophic was happening downstairs, related to that glass of juice David had given me, related to my comment about Monica drinking the same thing. Made my way slowly down the hallway with my walker, each step taking effort because my legs were shaking from fear and confusion about what was happening. Could hear David's voice from the kitchen getting louder and more desperate, screaming Monica's name over and over with a terror that made my blood run cold. Had never heard my son sound like that in his entire life, not even when his mother had died suddenly when he was young. This was pure panic and horror beyond anything I could understand. Reached the top of the stairs and started the careful descent, holding tight to the railing because my hands were trembling. Heard glass shattering in the kitchen and Monica's voice raised in shock and confusion. David was still screaming, his words becoming clearer as I got closer, hearing him sob, "Did you drink it? Did you drink the juice?" over and over like a desperate prayer. The raw fear in his voice made me move faster despite my age and unsteady legs. Something terrible was happening and I needed to understand what. Got to the bottom of the stairs and could see into the kitchen from the hallway. Saw David with both hands gripping Monica's face roughly, his fingers pressing into her cheeks while he stared at her mouth like he was examining it. Monica looked terrified and completely bewildered, trying to pull away from him while he held her tight. Green juice was splattered across the wall and floor, where apparently another glass had been smashed, shattered glass everywhere, creating a dangerous scene. David was sobbing openly with tears streaming down his face, his whole body shaking as he screamed at Monica, asking if she'd drunk the green juice, demanding she tell him the truth right now. His voice was breaking with emotion, sounded like a man facing the end of everything he cared about, the kind of desperation that comes from watching someone you love die in front of you. Monica kept saying she didn't understand what he was talking about, asking why he was acting insane and what was wrong with him. He grabbed the glass that had been in Monica's hand moments before and smashed it violently against the wall, green liquid exploding across the white paint and cabinet doors. The crash made Monica scream and jump back, made her stare at her husband like he'd lost his mind and become dangerous. David fell to his knees on the kitchen floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled juice, his hands shaking as he pulled out his phone and tried to dial with trembling fingers. Could hear him trying to dial emergency services, his voice barely functional as he gasped out that he needed an ambulance immediately, that his wife had been poisoned and was going to die. Monica's face transformed from confusion and fear into something else when she heard those words, horror and understanding starting to dawn as she processed what her husband had just said. She backed away from David, pressing herself against the counter, staring at him with an expression that showed she was beginning to understand something terrible. David kept sobbing and trying to talk to the emergency operator. Could hear him saying the juice was poisonous, that it was meant to, and then he stopped mid-sentence. Watched him freeze completely as he realized what he was about to say, realized he was confessing something he hadn't meant to reveal. The phone fell from his hand and clattered onto the floor, the operator's voice still coming from the speaker, asking for clarification about the emergency. Monica's face showed the exact moment she understood what had almost just been said, what David had stopped himself from admitting. Her expression changed from confused fear to absolute horror, her hand coming up to cover her mouth as she stared at her husband kneeling in broken glass and spilled juice. The silence that followed David's incomplete confession was deafening, all three of us frozen in that kitchen as the truth began crystallizing in the air. My own legs nearly gave out as understanding crashed over me like freezing water, had to grip my walker tight to stay standing as the pieces assembled in my mind. David had said the juice was poisonous, had said it was meant for someone, had panicked when he'd thought Monica had drunk it. The smile he'd given me upstairs when handing me that glass, the care and warmth I'd felt, none of it had been real. Shuffled into the kitchen doorway with my walker, all three of us frozen in a terrible tableau of broken glass and spilled green juice and dawning horror. Monica was pressed against the counter, staring at David, who was still on his knees, surrounded by shattered glass, his phone on the floor with the emergency operator's voice asking if anyone was still there. Nobody moved or spoke for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, the weight of what David had almost confessed hanging in the air, making it hard to breathe. Monica finally broke the silence, her voice shaking as she asked David what he'd just said about the juice being poisonous, asked him to explain what he'd meant when he'd said it was meant for someone. David didn't answer, just stared at the floor, breathing hard, his whole body trembling. Monica's voice got louder and more insistent, demanding he look at her and tell her the truth about what was happening, asking him directly if he'd tried to poison her. David finally looked up at his wife with tears streaming down his face, shook his head desperately and said, no, he hadn't tried to poison her. She was never supposed to drink that juice. Monica's face showed confusion, mixed with relief for just a moment, before the other implication of his words hit her, before she understood that if she wasn't supposed to drink the poison juice, then someone else must have been the intended target. Watched her eyes move from David to me, standing in the doorway with my walker, saw the horrible realization spread across her face. She asked in a whisper if the poison juice had been meant for me. If David had prepared poison specifically for his 91-year-old father and brought it to my room with a smile. David didn't answer, but his silence and the guilty devastation on his face confirmed everything. Monica started backing away from her husband, looking at him like he was a monster she'd never seen before, her hand over her mouth and tears starting to form in her eyes. Started explaining in a rushed, panicked voice that she'd never drunk the poisoned juice David had prepared, that she'd made her own fresh juice that morning from vegetables in the refrigerator like she did most days. ran to the counter and pointed at two different containers. One commercial bottle of store-bought juice and one fresh pitcher she'd made herself that morning. Said she'd poured her healthy drink from her own pitcher and had no idea David had prepared anything separately, had never touched whatever glass he'd made for his father. David looked up with an expression of desperate relief mixed with horror, realized his wife wasn't going to die from poison, but also realized his attempted murder had been completely exposed. The glass he'd carefully prepared with rat poison mixed into healthy juice was still sitting somewhere upstairs, where he'd snatched it from my hands, still intact with evidence of exactly what he'd planned to do. His panic about Monica drinking the poison had made him confess to attempted murder in front of both his wife and his intended victim. Monica kept repeating that she couldn't believe this was happening, couldn't process that her husband had actually prepared poison for his own father and brought it to him with a smile. Asked David how he could do something like this. What kind of person tries to murder their 91-year-old father who'd done nothing except get old? Her voice was getting hysterical, kept asking why and how and what was wrong with him, backing further away like she was afraid of what he might do next. I stood in the doorway, feeling like my legs would collapse under me, gripping my walker so hard my arthritic hands hurt from the pressure. Couldn't process what I was hearing and seeing. Couldn't make sense of the fact that my son had prepared poison for me and served it with warmth and kindness. The smile he'd given me upstairs, the care in his voice, all of it had been performance designed to make me drink willingly. He'd wanted me to die grateful for his sudden attention, wanted my last thought to be that my son still loved me. David suddenly screamed at Monica that she was going to die, his voice raw with desperation, even though she'd just explained she'd never drunk the poisoned juice he'd prepared. His mind seemed unable to process her words through his panic, kept insisting she'd consumed poison and needed emergency medical help immediately. Grabbed his phone from the floor with shaking hands and tried to dial emergency services again, his fingers barely functional as he sobbed and tried to explain the situation to the operator who'd remained on the line. Could hear him telling the emergency operator that his wife had drunk poisonous juice, that it contained rat poison, and she needed an ambulance right away. The operator asked how he knew the juice contained poison, and David started to answer, began saying, "Because I put it there, it was meant for," before his voice cut off mid-sentence. Watched the exact moment he realized what he was confessing, saw his face go pale as he understood he was admitting to attempted murder to emergency services, while his wife and intended victim both stood there listening. Monica's face transformed from fear and confusion into complete horror as she processed what David had just said, as she understood he'd deliberately put rat poison in juice and prepared it for someone specific. She started screaming at him, asking what he'd done, demanding he tell her the complete truth about who the poison had been meant for. David dropped the phone again and put his face in his hands, his whole body shaking with sobs as the weight of his exposed crime crushed him. Monica kept screaming questions at David through her own tears, asking if he'd really tried to poison his own father, asking how long he'd been planning this and why he'd do something so evil. David couldn't seem to form words anymore, just knelt there surrounded by broken glass, sobbing into his hands while his wife and father stared at him with horror. The emergency operator's voice kept calling from the dropped phone, asking if anyone could hear them and requesting confirmation of the address. My own legs finally gave out, and I had to lean heavily on my walker to stay upright. Felt tears streaming down my face as the full reality of what had happened crashed over me. My son had prepared rat poison mixed into healthy juice specifically to kill me, had brought it to my room with a smile and kind words, had wanted me to die thinking he still loved me. The warmth I'd felt in my chest when he'd handed me that glass had been based on a complete lie, manufactured kindness designed to make me trust him enough to drink poison. Tried to understand how David could have planned this, how he could have researched poisons and purchased rat poison and carefully mixed it into juice, all while knowing it would kill his 91-year-old father who'd raised him alone. Thought about him standing in the kitchen measuring out poison. Thought about him practicing his smile before bringing it upstairs. Thought about him watching me lift that glass toward my mouth. Every part of the plan had been deliberate and calculated. Nothing about it was impulsive or accidental. The only reason I was still alive was because I'd casually mentioned seeing Monica with similar juice, a completely innocent observation that had triggered David's panic about his wife being poisoned instead of me. If I'd just drunk the juice without saying anything, I'd probably be dead or dying right now, would be collapsed in my room with David calling emergency services pretending to be a devastated son who'd just found his father unresponsive. The timing of that observation had saved my life by pure accident. Monica was still demanding answers, asking David directly if he'd really tried to murder his father for the inheritance money, asking if he'd valued $12 million more than his own father's life. David finally looked up at her with devastation written across his face, didn't verbally confirm, but his expression admitted everything. The guilty horror in his eyes told us he'd planned to kill me for money, had decided financial desperation justified murdering the man who'd raised him and provided everything he'd ever had. Felt something break inside me that could never be repaired, some fundamental trust in the world and in family that had sustained me through 91 years of life. My son had tried to kill me with poisoned juice, served with a smile. Monica suddenly screamed that what David was saying wasn't possible, that she couldn't have drunk poisoned juice because she'd made her own fresh drink that morning from vegetables in their refrigerator. Her voice was getting more frantic and desperate, started backing away from David toward the counter where containers of juice sat. Kept repeating that she'd made her own healthy smoothie like she did most mornings, used spinach and cucumber and apple from the produce drawer, never touched anything David had prepared or anything sitting out on the counter. She ran to the counter and grabbed a large glass pitcher, held it up showing everyone the fresh green juice she'd made herself that morning. Pointed at the blender still sitting dirty in the sink with vegetable remnants stuck to the sides, evidence she'd recently made her own drink. Explained through tears that she'd poured herself a glass from her pitcher around 8:30 while checking morning emails, had been standing at the counter drinking her own juice when I'd apparently walked past and seen her. Monica then pointed at a different glass sitting on the counter near the refrigerator, a tall glass filled with thick green liquid that looked identical to what she'd made herself. Said she'd never noticed that glass or touched it, had no idea David had prepared anything separately, because their kitchen always had various juices and drinks sitting around. Realized now that David must have made the poison juice and placed it strategically where he could grab it quickly when ready to bring it to me, kept it separate from the safe juice his wife had made for herself. She grabbed the glass David had prepared and held it up with shaking hands. This was the poison meant for me that had never been consumed by anyone. Asked David directly if this glass contained rat poison, if this was what he'd planned to give his father to drink. David looked at the glass and started sobbing harder, his non-answer confirming everything. Monica set it down carefully like it was a bomb that might explode, backed away from it with her hand over her mouth. Monica's panic from moments ago when she'd thought she was poisoned transformed into horror and disgust as she realized what her husband had done. As she understood she'd been married to someone capable of murdering their own father for money. Started screaming at David that he was a monster, that she couldn't believe she'd shared a life with someone who'd planned something so evil. Said she'd noticed him being stressed about money lately but never imagined he'd consider murder as a solution to financial problems. She kept looking between David and me, her expression showing she was trying to reconcile the man she'd been married to for years with someone who'd carefully prepare poison for his elderly father. Asked how he'd been able to smile at me and hand me that juice knowing what was in it, how he'd been able to pretend kindness while actively trying to kill me. Said she didn't recognize him anymore, that the person kneeling in front of her covered in spilled juice and broken glass was a stranger wearing her husband's face. Monica explained that she'd thought David's distance from me over recent months was just normal stress about having an elderly parent living with them, had noticed him being less patient and more withdrawn, but attributed it to work pressure. Never suspected he'd been planning murder, never imagined his frustration with my presence had evolved into active homicidal intent. Said she'd defended him to her own parents when they'd suggested David was treating me poorly, had insisted he was just overwhelmed and tired. She started crying harder as she processed her own complicity through ignorance, realized she'd been living in a house where her husband was planning to poison his father, and she'd noticed nothing. Asked David how long he'd been planning this, how many times he'd thought about killing me while sitting at dinner or watching television or going about normal daily life. Wanted to know if this was the first attempt or if there had been other plans that hadn't worked out, other methods he'd considered before settling on rat poison in juice. The emergency operator's voice was still coming from David's dropped phone, now saying police had been dispatched to the address along with paramedics, that everyone needed to stay on the line and remain where they were. Monica heard this and seemed to realize the full legal implications of what had happened, that her husband was about to be arrested for attempted murder. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes of David's frantic call, rushing into the house with emergency medical equipment expecting to find someone dying from poison. Found Monica standing against the kitchen counter crying but physically fine. Found David kneeling on the floor in broken glass still sobbing. Found me leaning heavily on my walker in the doorway in shock. The lead paramedic looked confused about who the actual patient was, started asking what emergency they'd been called for and who had been poisoned. Monica explained through tears that nobody had actually consumed the poison, that her husband had prepared poisoned juice intending to kill his father, but she'd accidentally been mistaken for having drunk it instead. Pointed at the glass sitting on the counter that David had prepared, told the paramedics that glass contained rat poison meant for the 91-year-old man standing in the doorway. The paramedics looked at David with immediate suspicion and concern, one of them carefully picking up the glass with gloved hands to preserve it as evidence. Police officers arrived 3 minutes after the paramedics had been dispatched because the emergency call involved suspected poisoning, which required criminal investigation. 2 officers entered the kitchen taking in the scene of broken glass and spilled juice, and 3 people in various states of emotional distress. The senior officer asked what had happened, and Monica immediately started explaining, her words tumbling out in a rush about David preparing poison for his father and panicking when he'd thought she'd drunk it instead. Told the officers everything that had happened from my perspective with tears streaming down my face. Explained that David had brought me juice with a smile and I'd been so happy thinking my son still loved me. Said I'd mentioned his wife had been drinking the same juice and David had panicked, had run downstairs screaming and confessing that the juice was poisonous. The officers listened carefully, taking notes, their expressions growing harder as they understood what they were dealing with. One officer asked David directly if he'd prepared poisoned juice intending to give it to his father, if the glass on the counter contained rat poison he'd deliberately mixed. David didn't answer, just continued crying with his face in his hands, his silence functioning as confirmation. The officer told David he needed to answer questions or invoke his right to remain silent, that anything he said could be used against him. David finally looked up and whispered that he wanted a lawyer. First words he'd spoken in minutes. The officers placed David under arrest for attempted murder, reading him his rights while putting handcuffs on his wrists. He didn't resist, just let them pull him to his feet and secure his hands behind his back, still crying, but seeming almost relieved that the horrible situation was finally over. One officer led him outside to a patrol car, while the other stayed to take detailed statements from Monica and me, collecting evidence including the glass of poisoned juice. The paramedics examined me thoroughly, checking my vital signs and asking if I'd consumed any of the juice. Seemed relieved when I confirmed I'd never taken a single sip. One of them told me I was extremely lucky, said rat poison in the concentration David had probably used would have killed someone my age within hours. Asked if I needed medical evaluation or felt unsafe, offered to take me to the hospital if I wanted to be checked over by doctors. The remaining police officer carefully photographed the kitchen scene, documented the broken glass and spilled juice, and the intact poisoned glass David had prepared. Asked Monica to show him the pitcher of safe juice she'd made that morning, had her explain the timeline of events and how the confusion about who'd drunk what had led to David's panicked confession. Bagged the poisoned glass as evidence along with David's phone that had recorded parts of his confession to the emergency operator. Monica gave a detailed statement about David's recent behavior and financial stress, mentioned he'd been obsessed with my health, and had made comments about me taking too long to die naturally. Told the officer about David's mood changes over recent months, how he'd become increasingly distant from me and stressed about money. Said she'd never suspected he was capable of murder, but looking back there had been warning signs she'd missed or dismissed. Detectives arrived at the house within an hour to conduct a thorough investigation, obtained search warrants for David's computer and phone and financial records. found his laptop in his home office, and began examining his internet search history, discovered weeks of disturbing searches that painted a clear picture of premeditation. Searches included phrases like, untraceable poisons for elderly people, how to fake natural death in 90-year-olds, symptoms of heart attack versus rat poison, and do they autopsy old people who die at home? The search history showed David had been researching this murder for at least 2 months, had spent hours reading about various poison methods and how to avoid detection by authorities. Found articles he'd saved about inheritance law and estate settlement timelines, pages about how long it typically took to probate wills and access inherited money. The computer forensics painted a picture of someone carefully planning murder while researching how to profit from it as quickly as possible. Detectives found receipts in David's email for rat poison purchased online under a fake name, had it delivered to a P.O. box he'd rented specifically for this purpose. The receipts showed he'd bought industrial-strength rat poison in quantities far beyond what anyone would need for actual pest control, amounts clearly intended for poisoning a human being. Found confirmation emails showing he'd researched which types of rat poison would be hardest to detect in autopsies and which would cause symptoms most similar to natural heart failure. Found emails between David and his accountant discussing his financial situation, messages revealing he owed over $2 million to various creditors and was facing potential bankruptcy. The accountant had asked about potential sources of capital, and David had mentioned his father's $12 million estate, asked specific questions about inheritance timelines and whether estates could be settled quickly. The accountant had apparently not realized David was planning murder, thought they were just discussing unfortunate future events and estate planning. Detectives discovered more emails where David had asked his accountant about procedures for inheriting and liquidating real estate quickly, wanted to know if he could access estate funds before full probate was complete, had inquired about taking loans against expected inheritance, discussed which creditors needed to be paid first to avoid legal action. The financial desperation was clear in every message. David was drowning in debt and viewing my death as his only solution. Found text messages on David's phone to a friend from several weeks ago where he'd complained about me taking too long to die naturally, said he couldn't wait years for inheritance when he needed money immediately. The friend had apparently made a joke about helping things along, and David had responded with a laughing emoji, but then had gone silent on that conversation thread. The text messages established that David had been vocally wishing for my death weeks before actually attempting to poison me. Monica cooperated fully with investigators once she'd recovered from the initial shock, gave them access to joint financial records showing the extent of David's debt problems. Told detectives that David had been obsessively checking on my health over recent weeks, would ask her if I seemed weaker or more tired than usual, made comments about how much longer she thought I'd live. Said she'd found these comments odd, but had attributed them to stress rather than homicidal planning. She told investigators that David had been reading my medical records when he'd thought she wasn't paying attention, had been tracking my doctor's appointments and asking me detailed questions about what the doctor had said about my life expectancy. Monica said she'd noticed him watching me more closely lately, studying me in ways that had made her vaguely uncomfortable, but she'd dismissed as her imagination. Now understood he'd been assessing my health to determine if natural death was likely soon enough to save him from bankruptcy. The detectives found notes on David's computer listing my medications and medical conditions, notes about my daily routines, and when I was alone in my room. Found a timeline he'd created showing when Monica would be out of the house for extended periods, when the children would be at school, when he'd have opportunity to give me poison without witnesses. Every detail of the planned murder had been documented on his computer, creating an overwhelming evidence trail that would be impossible to defend against in court. David is currently serving 25 years for attempted murder in a state penitentiary 3 hours from where I used to live. Will be nearly 70 years old before he's eligible for parole if he serves his full sentence. The judge had been particularly harsh during sentencing, said that attempting to murder your own 91-year-old father for inheritance money showed a level of depravity that warranted maximum punishment. Said David had violated the most sacred bond between parent and child, had planned to kill the man who'd raised him alone and sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. Monica filed for divorce immediately after David's arrest, couldn't reconcile staying married to someone who'd planned to murder his father in their home while she and the children lived there. She'd testified against him during the trial, provided evidence of his financial desperation and the comments he'd made about me taking too long to die. The divorce was finalized within 6 months. She took the children and moved across the country to live near her parents, wanted distance from the nightmare her marriage had become. Live alone now in a secure assisted living facility about an hour from where David's mansion used to be, sold that property and used proceeds to fund comfortable private care. The facility has 24-hour security and strict visitor policies. Nobody can access residents without explicit permission from both the resident and facility management. David has tried multiple times to get on my approved visitor list through his attorney, requests I've denied every single time without hesitation. My $12 million estate has been protected through ironclad trust documents that explicitly exclude David from any inheritance, hired attorneys to ensure that even if I die, he receives nothing. The money will eventually go to charities and distant relatives who actually treated me with kindness, people who never viewed my life as an obstacle to their financial security. David destroyed any claim to inheritance the moment he prepared that poisoned juice and brought it to me with a manufactured smile. The hardest part of everything that happened isn't that David tried to kill me, isn't the months of legal proceedings or the trauma of testifying against my own son. The hardest part is those 30 seconds when he'd walked into my room carrying that glass of green juice with warmth in his eyes and a genuine-looking smile on his face. For 30 brief seconds, I'd believed my son still loved me. Thought maybe he'd remembered I was his father and not just an inconvenient old man taking up space in his house. That moment of hope and joy I'd felt when he'd handed me that juice was based on complete deception, manufactured kindness designed specifically to make me trust him enough to drink poison. He'd practiced that smile, chosen those kind words carefully, wanted me to die grateful for his sudden attention and care. The cruelty of that calculated false kindness feels worse than if he'd just poisoned me without the performance. The emotional manipulation added a layer of betrayal that cuts deeper than the physical danger. Never took a single sip of the poison juice because of a casual, innocent observation about Monica drinking similar juice. Pure chance that saved my life when David's panic made him confess everything. If I'd just quietly drunk what he'd given me, I'd be dead now. Would have died thinking my son had finally shown he cared about me. Would have spent my last conscious moments feeling grateful and loved instead of knowing the truth about his murderous intentions. I'm 93 years old now, been living in this assisted living facility for almost 2 years, surrounded by staff who treat me with genuine kindness and respect. My health has actually improved since leaving David's house. The stress and emotional isolation had been destroying me faster than age alone. Feel safer knowing David is in prison and can't access me. Knowing the $12 million he tried to kill me for will never be his. David sends letters from prison every few months that I return unopened. Refuses to read his apologies or explanations because nothing he could say would make me forget he prepared poison for his father. His children don't visit or write. Monica told them the full truth about what their father did, and they've apparently chosen to distance themselves from him completely. He lost everything through his attempt to murder me for money, destroyed his family and his freedom and any relationship with his children, all for an inheritance he'll never receive.